Jake Stuart with the National Sports Media Association. Today, I'm joined by North Carolina Sportscaster of the Year for 2021, Joe Person. Joe, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, good to be here, man.
Well, first off, Joe, obviously you're from North Carolina. You're a writer for The Athletic for the Charlotte Panthers. I want to ask you, though, what brought you into the industry? What made you want to work in sports?
So it's a great question. I grew up actually in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, home of Little League Baseball. So I was a baseball guy, kind of a sports guy all my life. Went to college at William & Mary, was fortunate enough to play football there. And I loved writing. I grew up in a newspaper family in Williamsport. And so I got the opportunity to do some summer internships, both at my hometown paper, and I actually did a news internship at CNN. Liked it okay, but it's like really nothing like sports writing. I knew I didn't want to coach. I didn't want to put in those kind of hours. So I really was able to kind of marry two of my passions, and that's athletics and of course, writing and journalism. And it's been terrific.
Well, Joe, you mentioned that you played football in college. I'm curious. I wanted to ask you, how much does that add to your perspective as a writer?
Yeah, so I've always enjoyed the human element of sports, really more than X's and O's. It's much to my detriment that I will admit that I was not a huge film guy at William & Mary. It would have been very helpful over the course of my career, but I liked the camaraderie. I liked athletes overcoming adversity. Just the whole cool network of friendships and connections that you gain through sports. And that's how it's probably helped me more than anything. Side note, Mike Tomlin was a teammate of mine. Mike Tomlin was into the film study. Look what he's gone on to do.
It paid off for him.
he did well, but this was my tract, and I'm perfectly satisfied, been thrilled with it. And really, it's just been nice to continue, as I said earlier, Jake, just to stay in the sports industry in a business I love.
Absolutely. And Joe, this is your first award from the National Sports Media Association. Well, what does it mean to you to be recognized?
Humbled that when I got the call from Dave, that was my immediate reaction, and the word I think I used to him. When you see the roster of talent every year that NSMA honors and feats at their banquet, it's just so impressive. And my role or my honor is just a very small piece of it, but trust me, I do not take it lightly. Was thrilled to get that phone call back a couple months ago, and just really looking forward to being a part of the ceremony and the celebratory weekend coming up in June.
Well, we sure look forward to having you in Winston this summer. Well, I want to ask you, Joe, you talked earlier about being on the newspaper, writing at an earlier age while you were still playing. Who were some of the writers that you looked up to growing up?
So this wasn't a guy, well, first of all, yes, at my hometown paper, I don't know that anyone will know this name, but it was a gentleman named Ray Keyes. And Ray would cover local sports. And I think he covered like the first X number of 30 Little League World Series in my little hometown of Williamsport, but he would also go to Philadelphia. And as I said, I had some family members that worked at the paper with Ray Keyes, and he would bring me back like the press notes that they had handed out at Veterans Stadium for the Phillies games. And that kind of stuff made an impact. And I was probably 10 years old. And I remember reading those press notes, like way before the internet, all this, you'd come back with a handful of it wasn't even 8x11 papers. It was like 11x17 sheets of all you could want to read about the Phillies. So that was very cool. And then early in my career, there's a gentleman, I think he's been honored by NSMA, named Steve Hummer with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Yep. Just retired. I was living in Atlanta, kind of a young cub reporter. I was kind of working with him, not really. It was a part-timer. And I could not read enough of Steve Hummer's columns. He just had a different way of attacking every story or column he wrote that, like, you could tell, like, he invested time and creative energy on every sentence. There were no like throwaway sentences, and he just and I've told him this. I mean, that he was a guy always looked up to this day. And I think I read where he's still going to be contributing to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution while retired, and that's a gift for any sports reader, any reader, period.
Well, you mentioned earlier, Joe, about writing beyond the box score and finding the human interest. Can you maybe tell our listeners about a story that stands out to you that you've been able to write so far?
One that just jumps immediately to mind was guess it was last summer. The Panthers have one of their star defensive players, Brian Burns, defensive end. He Florida State guy, first round pick, and grew up in Fort Lauderdale. And I knew a little bit about Burns' background, but there's a gentleman when they drafted him named Stanley McClover, and Stanley was a Panthers 7th round pick years ago. I forget if it was 9 or 11 years before Brian Burns got picked. I think they're half brothers. And Stanley, I kept seeing, like, the night they drafted Burns, Stanley was there in a tuxedo with Panthers. He had a Panther colored teal bow tie. And then you would see him pop up on Twitter from time to time, a lot, talking about his brother and how proud he was. Long story short, I call Stanley McClover. I just thought I was getting into a story about proud big brother, grateful younger brother. So it turns out, and I'm so thankful that Stanley shared his story with me, he had fallen on some hard times after his NFL career. He was broke, wasn't keeping a job, had some health issues, admittedly was going through different depression states. And it was when Burns was coming out of really kind of like his junior year, senior year of high school, Stanley started coaching him. They both played the same position, edge rusher, pass rusher. And through his working with Brian Burns, and mentoring, counseling, and coaching, there was a little public park in Fort Lauderdale they'd go over, and Stanley, a coach, he didn't even have like blocking dummies. He would use trees, teach Brian Burns to do a spin move around this oak tree, and it helped Stanley come out of his dark place. It's such a rewarding story to do. And I'm so thankful for Burns and Stanley for sharing it with me.
That's such an awesome story, and I'm sure you were surprised, like you said, at the result of that phone call and just how much you got. I'm sure you were scribbling all kinds of notes to write. That's such an awesome story. Well, I want to ask you too, Joe, how much did your work change as a result of COVID coming in, if at all?
Well, yeah, sure. In some ways it became easier, right? Like, I didn't have to drive through traffic to the stadium. I only had, I had to watch from afar, from the practice field. You couldn't get close, but sports fans and readers suffered because you also couldn't get in the locker room and you couldn't get that intimacy. And by that, I mean breaking through kind of like those barriers, like I was telling you about with the Stanley story. And that, for so many times that you go in there, it's like, hey, tell me about the interception or the touchdown. When we have access to the players just on a regular Thursday afternoon in week 8, and you've done all the reporting on the stories you're going to do that week, those were some of my favorite times in the locker room, because I would just sidle up to a second team corner or a third team offensive lineman and just start talking to them the way you and I are. And it wasn't okay, I've got my tape recorder out and you're the athlete and I'm the sports reporter. It was talking as people, as individuals, and you get to know them. And through those conversations is when you get to, you build the trust, and then you can do those types of cool impactful stories, taking readers kind of behind the curtain and really doing the kind of stories that I like to do with the Athletic.
So awesome. The last question I want to ask you, Joe, and thank you so much for your time and for coming, is what advice do you have for younger sports writers just, getting into the industry now?
Follow your passion. Like I said, I know there's a lot of doom and gloom about how newspapers have shrunk and like the print version is kind of slowly dying off. But I don't think it ever fully go away. Like when a team wins a championship, I think I saw this recently with South Carolina women's basketball, Dawn Staley's program. Fans want a keepsake. They don't want to print something off of their computer. And that's just a small example. But even if we agree, and it's obvious, clearly we agree that the print market is shrinking, very much so, there's still a need, a very strong need for talented journalists who want to get behind the story, that want to question, people, political leaders, sports leaders, and hold them accountable, but also to tell the cool stories that you can't write in 12 inches, that you need some time and some energy. And that's the one great thing about the internet, right? Like it doesn't have to fit into this 12-inch hole on the front of the sports section at the Athletic and everywhere. I mean, you can write and share the story as long as it needs to be to do it right. And that's just, so I would tell young folks, there's still great opportunities and always will be.
I love that advice. Some inspiration. It's not too late to get in. We all sure hope that, like you said, the print industry can stay active and stay alive. Well, Joe, thank you so much for being here, our 2021 North Carolina Sportscaster of the Year. We look forward to seeing you in person this summer in Winston.
Jake, it was my pleasure, and I really appreciate you doing this.
Absolutely.